Hey friends, so in this video, what we're going to talk about is Descartes' third meditation, in which he argues for God's existence. So, bigger question, why is he doing this at this particular point in the meditations? Well, recall what we've seen so far. So far, we've seen that Descartes implements his skeptical hypotheses, and we've also seen that he proves that he knows that he exists, right? He has good reason to think that he exists. And he also knows that his thoughts exist, right? So, for Descartes, we can think of him as being stuck inside of himself in the following sense. He can be sure only of what he has introspective awareness of. He knows his own thoughts. He knows his own mechanisms of thinking. What he does not know is whether those thoughts connect with stuff out in the world. So, where does God enter into this picture? Well, God enters in acting as a bridge between Descartes and the world outside of him. Now, that doesn't become apparent until meditation 6, but I want to cue you into this now because it sort of sets the stage for why he's doing an argument for God's existence now, and what role God is going to play later on in the meditations. So let's get to the argument. So, I've got the argument right here. So the argument is this. Reach back into 101, recall the pattern of modus ponens, right? If P then Q, P therefore Q. And here's our argument. If I have an idea of God, then God exists. I have an idea of God, therefore God exists. Now the argument is sound. Strike that. Argument is valid. The argument is valid, right? The conclusion follows from the premises. And so the question we want to ask ourselves is, well, do we have reason to believe the premises? Right? In other words, this is a valid argument, but is it a sound argument? So let's go through each of the premises one by one. And it's easy to do them one by one because there's only two. So let's do the shorter one first. I have an idea of God. So why think this is true? Well, when I say to you God, right, and I'm talking about the Judeo-Christian, Islamic, the monotheistic conception of God as being all-powerful, all-caring, all-knowing, all-loving, right? You all know what I'm talking about, right? It's not like I'm saying words to you and you're like, sorry, dude, that doesn't resonate with me. I have no idea what you're talking about. No, you know what I'm talking about, and I know what I'm talking about when I say that I have an idea of God. So what's the evidence for our second premise? Well, I just have to think about my own thoughts, and I go, do I have an idea of God? Yes, I do, right? So our own thoughts is evidence of two. So let's go to our first premise here. If I have an idea of God, then God exists. So this one's a bit more nuanced. So what we do here in this argument is we say, suppose that I do in fact have an idea of God. How do I get from that beginning point to the idea that God exists, right? Assuming that I have this idea of God, how do I infer that God exists? Right. So Descartes' argument here is that assuming I have an idea of God, right? For Descartes, the question is, where does this idea come from? Right? Where could I have gotten this idea? Right? It's first important to note what the idea is an idea of, right? If we're going to know where it came from, a little more detail about what it is really helpful. So what is the idea of God? Well, the idea of God is an idea of the infinite, right? We say that God is good, but God's goodness is just leaps and bounds. It is unthinkably beyond what we know as goodness, right? We know what human love is, but God's love is infinitely deeper, wider, more profound than human love could ever be. We know what it is to be powerful. But God's power, it just makes our own human power just absurd, right? So an idea of God is an idea of the infinite. And importantly, we know what it is to be a finite, bounded being. We all exist in a single place, in a single time, right? Or, if we want to talk about the whole stretch of our lives, we exist in places all around the world for a finite span of time, 80 to 100 years if you're lucky. God, however, is not limited in this way. God does not exist in a single place. God is not bound to a single moment in time. God exists in all places at all times. God is beyond space and time. And so this is what we mean when we say that God is infinite. So where could we have gotten this idea? Descartes says that we could only have gotten an idea of the infinite from something that is actually infinite. Let me repeat that, because this is the crucial move in the argument. We could only have gotten an idea of the infinite from something that is actually infinite. Why think that? Well, when we ask ourselves, how could we come up with the idea of existing across all of space and all of time, or even more precisely, outside of space and time? How could we have come up with the idea of infinite love from finite things, right? Finite things are always bounded, right? In terms of existence, physical existence, they're bounded in space and time, right? My phone here has definite boundaries, and it will die on me one day. And in fact, one day, many, many hundreds of years from now, each of these parts will decompose. Everything in the world will come to an end. This is a fact for us. But God doesn't. So we could not, Descartes says, come up with an idea of the infinite, of something that has no ending, just by looking at the world around us. So the only other explanation is that we got our idea of the infinite from an actual infinite being. And that being is God. So, to sum up, why is it that God has to be the source of my idea of God? Because only an infinite being could give me the idea of an infinite being, right? Only an infinite thing could give me an idea of an infinite thing. So, what we have then is our two premises. If I have this idea of God, then God exists. Second premise, I do in fact have this idea of God, therefore God exists. So, what are some worries we might have about this? Well, let me just lay out two for you briefly. One is that we say we do in fact have an idea of God, but do we? So there's a tradition there within the Christian faith of what's called the via negativa. And this is learning about God or thinking about God by ascribing negations to our ordinary concepts. So God is love, but God is not, the via negativa says, human love, right? So the idea is that we take our ordinary everyday concepts of love, existence, goodness, and we try to strip away the boundaries, right? We try to strip away the limits, and we come up with our idea of God that way. But that's not really a positive idea of God. It just says whatever God's love is, it's not finite like mine, or like anybody else in the world. And so we might have an idea of the infinite, but it's not an idea of the infinite that's like, encompassing this gigantic, omnipotent, omniscient, omnicompassionate entity. So the idea of God that we have might be different from the idea of God that Descartes needs in order to make the argument work. The second point that I want to make is that Descartes says that only God could be responsible for our idea of God. But a different explanation we might have is that, or we might look to our friends in evolutionary psychology to say, why do we have this idea of God? And our evolutionary psychology and our evolutionary cultural psychology friends might say, well, look, it turns out that the idea of God has a lot of benefits to it. People who believe that God exists live happier lives, right? And there are some other benefits that come along with believing that God exists. So, why do we believe that God exists? Because it turns out that it's advantageous for us to believe that God exists.